I'm Danielle Wood. I'm CEO of the Grattan Institute, and I am joined by Bianca Hartge-Hazelman, co-founder and CEO of the Financy Women's Index. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands from which we join this webinar and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And given it's International Women's Day, I'd like to particularly recognise Indigenous women, their connection to land and sea and their contribution to community. We know that International Women's Day can be a busy one, or hopefully a relaxing one if you're enjoying the public holiday in Victoria. But either way, our aim is to get you quickly informed about women's progress over the past year, as well as starting the conversation about opportunities for change. We're launching two important reports here today. First, from Grattan, Women's Work, the impact of the COVID crisis on Australian women. We're hugely grateful to the support of the Extra Foundation for the report, which you may have gathered focuses on the impact of COVID on women, both at work and at home, and the policy opportunities to build back better for Australia. Second, from Financy, we have the December quarter of the Women's Index, which tracks Australia's progress towards gender equality. Bianca and I are going to take you through the highlights package of each report, and we'll save a few minutes for speed questions at the end. So if you have any questions as we go through, pop them in the chat and we'll endeavour to give you a speedy answer. We hope to have you out of here informed and inspired by 10:50. Starting with the Grattan report, it has been a year since the start of the pandemic, and we know that it's had big impacts on the lives of all Australians. But as we found in the report, it's particularly impacted women, and we talk about the triple whammy that women's faced. First, at work, they were more likely to lose jobs and hours, and you can see there at the height of the lockdown, a big impact on women's work. Second of all, unpaid load. We saw a big rise in care and housework during the pandemic, particularly because of the rise of remote learning. Both women and men did more, but women took on incrementally extra, and that's on top of what's already a considerable disparity in unpaid work between women and men. And finally, in terms of government supports, women were more likely to miss out on the big support, such as JobKeeper. That was because of design issues. The decision to exclude short-term casuals disproportionately meant women were left out because they tend to be those short-term casuals in the sectors that were hit hard, like hospitality, like retail, and like the arts. The other element of the government response was direct support for certain sectors. And you can see there it was very skewed towards what I'm calling the hard hat sectors. Construction, utilities, manufacturing actually received more dollars than the rest of the economy combined, despite the fact that they're only a small share of total jobs and were nowhere near the hardest hit in this pandemic. Those hard hit sectors, arts, hospitality, tourism, receive far less in dollar terms. As we move to the recovery, good news is jobs are coming back. There are groups that are still really struggling, and we point to single parents in the report as a particular concern. 80% of them are women, 30% down in hours at the height of pandemic, and still 10% before pre-COVID normal. That is a real issue. And even as the economy overall starts to recover, unemployment is still elevated, 6.4%, short of this recession, still the highest level in 20 years, and is expected to remain well above the rate of full employment for at least another 3 years. That means that we will continue to see long tail effects, and we know that the scarring effects of employment particularly impact women. They come on top of what is already a very significant lifetime earnings gaps, more than $2 million gap between earnings between men and women that go on to have children. Just 6 months out of the workforce for women during COVID put out another $100,000 to that gap. So this is a step backwards for the progress that we had been making towards greater lifetime equality. What can governments do? In the short term, the most important thing is to not step back from supporting the economy too early. We need to get back to full employment as soon as possible and see wages moving again. So in the report, we set out a whole lot of short-term stimulus type supports that would be really valuable, including extending the JobMaker wage subsidy scheme, vouchers to support consumption in the sectors that are still struggling to recover, like the arts and tourism, as well as a whole lot of different services, stimulus spending to support social services. In the long term, we need to be talking about how we build back better. The single biggest lever that government has available is improving the accessibility of early childhood education and care. Extremely important for childhood brain development and education going forward, but really a very significant lever for women's workforce participation. We also talk in the report about the need for structural reforms in the aged care sector and the need to look at caring jobs more generally. These are the jobs of the future. They tend to be poorly paid and have poor conditions. We need to make them good jobs if we're going to meet those future needs. And finally, we need to throw out the playbook in terms of how we deal with recessions. The world has changed. We are a services economy. We need to think about stimulus differently if we're going to build back better, and we need to include gender analysis as part of the budget processes. That is my very fast review of the Grattan report. I'm going to now hand over to Bianca. And Bianca, it would be fantastic if you could tell us a little bit about the Women's Index and what it showed for the December quarter.
Thank you, Danielle, for sharing all of that with us. It's nice to be speaking with everybody today to help put a lot of what Danielle has highlighted about what's happened over the past 12 months and the way women have been impacted and where it sits in terms of women's financial security. The Women's Index seeks to basically look at all this data and give you a score on whether women are going forwards or backwards when it comes to financial progress, and what does this mean if we're ever going to reach gender financial equality. So we're measuring employment, underemployment, wages, education, unpaid work, because we know that's a critical barrier when it comes to participation, the number of women on boards, and wealth through superannuation. So if I can share with you based on that, my screen now, and I'll take you through the key findings, putting it all into perspective as to where we are for women. So I am hopefully sharing this screen correctly. Shout out to me if I'm not. Here we go. Right. So when we look at the years to gender equality, this is absolutely significant. Taking into account what's happened this year in terms of employment, in terms of wages, and looking at long-term systemic issues that affect women's financial progress, unpaid work, and in particular education, which actually we haven't got featured here, but that is part of this story. The time frame to economic equality has increased to 101 years this December quarter. And now that's largely because of this increase in unpaid work leading into the pandemic, mind you. And we know that that worsened through the ABS data during the pandemic as women took on greater care, housework, house management, whatever you want to call it, even unpaid paid work responsibilities as those lines between working from home and work became more abstract for men and women during COVID. So we've got this widening of the gender gap happening in unpaid work that is adding to this longer time frame to achieve gender financial equality. What has also happened as a consequence of this is that we're setting ourselves up for a harder road back post-COVID because of where we're at. And it's really important because if we're not starting to share the load, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, in terms of caring, in terms of housework or whatever you want to call those unpaid work duties, then it makes the capacity to work even more difficult. We know through the Women's Index that women are working at about 56% of their capacity when measuring paid and unpaid work versus about 80% for men. Now, because of COVID, both are at reduced capacity by about 2 points, but you get the drift in that significant difference between the two in terms of capacity. When we look at women's financial progress, with all that Danielle has spoken about, with all that you've probably read in the media, or maybe there's a little bit of fatigue even for you in terms of what's happened between pink and blue recessions this year, we know that women's financial progress collapsed in the December quarter. However, that long-term trend towards women's financial progress is continuing, and that is a good thing. And you do see that in a lot of official statistics. Overall, the year's gone better with property prices, but you had a collapse in one quarter over another. This is not unusual, but what we've seen in this December quarter in particular is that the recovery among women in employment growth was slower than that for men. And the gender gap widened as a result in those monthly hours worked. And the gender gap also widened in terms of that underemployment rate as well. The shocks as a result of all this, as we've seen 2020 largely wipe out 20 years of positive momentum for women in unpaid work. This is a huge concern. We've been progressively participating in the workforce as women, and that has somehow taken us right back a good year. Yes, it's affected men as well, but it's the momentum. And what we've seen with men is that when we look at full-time work in particular, men have actually been decreasing their amount of participation, whereas women have been accelerating that. So that trend is a very big concern because of COVID. The gender gap in unpaid work, as I've said before, has widened, with women doing more paid and unpaid work compared to men. And the average amount of money that is needed to retire on is actually increasing, and it's the gender gap. We could actually see that get even worse because of the impact on wages, not to mention early access to super. The opportunities moving forward for women, I'd like to focus on those because they are really important as we try to talk about a recovery, the government's response, business response as well. Male-dominated industries, it's worth highlighting that construction, transport, postal, warehousing actually did the most hiring of women in the December quarter. There is no doubt that the government stimulus there is having an impact, but as we know, that stimulus has gone down a path where we have historically always trodden. So we need to expand what that stimulus looks like in order to focus on those sectors that have been hardest hit and that are largely female-dominated. So there's an opportunity there to think about those fields for women as individuals to potentially work in, but also for businesses there to acknowledge that there has been a fallout effect for women and perhaps increase their gender diversity. Also, women accounted for nearly 43% of new board appointments for the ASX 200. I wanted to point this out because it's the best yearly result since record keeping began in over a decade. So what this is saying is that there is this increasing trend among top corporate leaders to increase gender diversity on board. There is this increasing perception that gender diversity is good for company performance. There is an opportunity now to upskill for individual women and for companies to do more to support women in those leadership positions. That trend is happening, and it is a key driver of women's financial equality. In fact, it's actually helped to support and prop up progress over the past 12 months. Education, this is the area that concerns me the most when I analyse all of this data, because it's the only indicator where the financial progress of women has actually stopped. It's gone backwards as we continue to select pathways that are linked to lower career earnings. And that's relative to men. Men are better at selecting, well, let's debate that, are better at selecting careers that have higher earnings potential, or are they in fields that actually already have that higher earnings potential because they're valued higher than female-dominated sectors. So there's an education piece that needs to happen early on in schools, I believe, when it comes to career choices. There's a continued upskilling process that needs to happen for women. We need to push the boundaries in terms of, if you're wanting that career boost, we know that more men are pursuing postgraduate management studies to accelerate their positions than are women, despite women being the majority when it comes to overall enrolments in higher educational fields. So we need to start to draw the dots between the correlation of what you're studying, you earn what you learn, and look at the opportunities within there. Worth mentioning too that fields like engineering, fields like information technology actually have a reverse gender gap in many ways, where women are coming out of those studies earning more than men. Finally, the gender pay gap is largest in professional, scientific and technical services, financial services and insurance services, and healthcare and social assistance, which is disappointing but not unexpected at all when you consider the majority of women in the Australian economy. If we look at sectors overall, those 12 sectors are employed by that sector, but we have about a significant percentage of men in the management positions relative to women in the management positions in the health sector. The smallest gender pay gaps are found in other services and public administration and safety. So some opportunities there if you're looking at jobs, where to go, or if you're looking at your sector and you're asking yourself, how can we do better? I've also provided a bit of a breakdown here, and I'm conscious of time. A bit of a breakdown here, just looking at those opportunities for salaries and the alignment there with courses. There's more in the Financy Women's Index if you want to see what your potential is there for women, for men. And that is me for the Financy Women's Index download speed session. I did my best.
Fantastic.
Writing up 40 pages.
Thank you, Bianca. It's wonderful to be at an event where the ability to talk fast is finally an asset, and I think both you and I have it in spades. So we have a very popular question come through from Tom, and others, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. But he asks, how much of a problem is it that most of our major economic policymakers are men? How can we get more women in the room when decisions are made about stimulus, childcare, etc.? It's a really interesting question, and I think just to provide a bit of context, might be worth noting. We've had a female prime minister, but never a female treasurer in this country. We've had female chief scientists, chief justice of the High Court, but we've never had a female treasury secretary, head of the Reserve Bank, head of ACCC, APRA, ASIC, any of the economic agencies. So, this is really has been a glass ceiling for women in terms of economic policy making in Australia. And my sense is that does have an impact on what issues are kind of in focus or put up at the top of the list. And, I do always find it interesting that we spend a lot of time hand-wringing about the incentive impacts of the top marginal tax rate, yet the fact that we know that second earners who are mainly women, are facing, a clawback of 80, 90, even 100% of their pay if they work beyond 3 days a week. So, I do think that flows through. Bianca, have you noticed it? Have you got any observations about how you think we can make a change in this space?
Yeah, well, the biggest observation over the years has been that as it stands, we've got 75% of our cabinet, our government, that is male dominated. So how is that reflective of a population that's 51% women? We're not asking to dominate the parliament, but we're certainly asking for equal representation. And until government becomes increasingly progressive around the actions to encourage more women beyond local government level, because there are a lot more women at that level, into those higher ranks and to influencing policy, particularly on the financial sense, it's going to be increasingly difficult to shift things along in terms of progress. So I suppose what really needs to happen there is there's two things in terms of the government's response, setting potential targets for increasing women into their leadership positions, to recognising the value there in reaching out, and to applying the gender lens and getting why it actually matters. Because it's often said, why do we need to do this? Why, if men are earning this amount and we know that they're still the majority of breadwinners, why do we need to do this when women could potentially win out in the end, or whatever that argument can be? Now, the reason we need to do this is because trends are changing. We've got generations growing up of women, of young boys thinking I'll be more of I'm going to work flexibly, girls thinking I'm going to have career first. Trends are changing. Society is changing. And if we're not moving with the times and adapting to an increasing rise of women as female breadwinners, then we are missing an opportunity to engage with the citizens of this country. And for a political party, that is actually a risky manoeuvre. So for the government at this point in time, if it wants to take the lead, it needs to listen to that. An opposing party might already be on the front foot there.
Yeah, fantastic answer. And that ties in with a question we had from Rose Reid about the role of data in influencing policy and decision makers. And I think you kind of touched on it there, Bianca, is actually having the data there in front of you to help shape the decisions. And I can't help but thinking, we used to do gender budgeting in this country that provided distributional analysis of the different impact of policies on men and women. Maybe the October budget might have looked different if they had done that gender analysis, but we know that didn't happen. So, it's when you have that absence of data that, things get overlooked. So I think it can genuinely make a difference.
Definitely. And when we have that gender data, to make it more relevant to men, to families, we need to bring it back to the financial case for it, the financial case for improving the economy, for improving the hip pockets of families. So it's not just seen as a gender lens for a gender lens sake. It's got to have the compelling reason that you and I understand by going through all this data, and many people do that are on this call, but we've really got to apply that so people get why it really matters. And it's not so much until, and we keep doing it until we actually don't need a gendered lens anymore. That's what I would say.
Exactly right. I am so sorry. We have two fantastic questions sitting there in the Q&A, and I will try and shoot answers offline to both of you because they are great. But the downside of a speed briefing is I do need to wrap up on time. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving us 20 minutes of your time. I certainly hope that you go away not just informed, but motivated to make change. In response to Angela's question, how do we keep pushing for gender equality? We've got to keep talking about it and getting more and more people informed and motivated. Thank you, Bianca. Thanks for the fantastic work that you do around the Financy Women's Index. And please go to the Grattan website and the Financy website and have a look at those reports. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully see you all soon.
Bye, everyone.